The tropical heat hung over the airfield like a suffocating blanket, thick with humidity and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood in the shadow of the P-38 Lightning, his weathered hands gripping a rag stained black with oil and grease. He was 42 years old, too old for combat but exactly the right age for the kind of experience that kept young men alive. His eyes, deep-set and perpetually tired, watched as Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes completed his pre-flight inspection with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this ritual 100 times before. Hayes was 23, with sandy hair that always seemed to escape from under his flight cap and a face that still retained some of the softness of youth despite 6 months in the Pacific theater. McKenna had watched dozens of pilots like Hayes climb into cockpits over the past 18 months, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed fear. Too many of them never came back, their aircraft twisted wreckage scattered across jungle islands or swallowed whole by the unforgiving ocean. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to Japanese air superiority, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter with devastating firepower and impressive speed. On paper, it was magnificent, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose, twin Allison engines that could push it to nearly 400 miles per hour, and a range that made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific. But McKenna knew the terrible secret that official reports and propaganda newsreels never mentioned. In a turning fight, the P-38 was a death trap. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's legendary fighter, could turn inside the American plane with ease, getting on its tail and staying there until the pilot was forced to make a desperate dive or die in a hail of machine gun fire. McKenna had read the after-action reports, had listened to the surviving pilots in the mess tent late at night when the whiskey loosened their tongues and the nightmares became words. "Never turn with a Zero," they said over and over like a prayer or a curse. "Boom and zoom. Hit them fast and get out. Never, ever try to turn with them." Hayes was different from most of the replacement pilots who cycled through the squadron. He listened when McKenna spoke, asked questions that showed he was thinking rather than just memorizing procedures, and treated the ground crew with respect rather than the casual contempt some officers displayed. 3 days earlier, Hayes had come to McKenna with a request that made the sergeant's blood run cold. He wanted to know if there was any way to make the P-38 more responsive in turns. Hayes had been jumped by a Zero while escorting bombers to Rabaul, had tried to evade by turning, and had nearly died when the Japanese pilot easily matched his turn and opened fire. Only a cloud bank had saved him, and the bullet holes in his starboard boom were testament to how close he had come to joining the growing list of casualties. McKenna had seen that look before, the look of a man who knew his luck was running out and was desperately searching for any edge, any advantage that might keep him alive for one more mission. The problem gnawed at McKenna like a persistent toothache. He had worked on aircraft since before the war, first in a civilian garage in Ohio where he repaired crop dusters and mail planes, then in the Army Air Forces when Pearl Harbor transformed mechanics into soldiers. He understood machines in a way that went beyond manuals and technical orders. He could feel when something was wrong, could diagnose problems by sound or vibration that other mechanics would miss. And he knew exactly what was killing pilots in the P-38, control cable slack. The cables that connected the control stick to the ailerons, the hinged surfaces on the wings that controlled roll and turning, had a small amount of play in them, a few millimeters of slack that was within factory tolerances but created a fatal delay between pilot input and aircraft response. In training flights over the United States, this delay was barely noticeable. But in combat, when a pilot needed to reverse direction instantly to shake a Zero off his tail, those few millimeters translated into a half-second delay that could be the difference between life and death. McKenna had studied the problem obsessively, lying awake at night in his tent while mosquitoes whined around his head and distant artillery rumbled like thunder. He had examined the cable routing, traced every pulley and fairlead, measured the tension with borrowed equipment. The solution was theoretically simple: eliminate the slack by adding a tensioner to the cable system. But the reality was far more complicated. Any modification to a military aircraft required approval through channels that stretched back to the United States, through layers of bureaucracy that could take months or years. There were regulations, procedures, technical orders that governed every bolt and wire. Unauthorized modifications were court-martial offenses, especially modifications that affected flight controls. McKenna knew he could lose his stripes, face military prison, destroy the career he had built over 2 decades. And yet, watching Hayes walk around the P-38, knowing that the young pilot was probably going to die on this mission or the next, McKenna felt something harden in his chest, a resolution that had been building for weeks. The airfield was coming alive around them as dawn broke over the jungle. Mechanics swarmed over other aircraft, running engines, loading ammunition, making last-minute adjustments. The smell of hot metal and exhaust mixed with the ever-present odor of decomposing vegetation from the jungle that pressed close on all sides. Squadron Commander Major Philip Reed strode across the tarmac, his flight jacket crisp despite the heat, barking orders and checking clipboards. Reed was a by-the-book officer, a man who believed that regulations existed for good reasons, and that deviation from proper procedure was the path to chaos. McKenna respected Reed's dedication but knew that the Major would never approve an unauthorized modification, no matter how many pilots died. The weight of command sat heavily on Reed's shoulders. McKenna could see it in the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was perpetually clenched. Every loss was personal to Reed, but he would never compromise on procedure. Hayes finished his inspection and turned to McKenna with a quick nod. "She looks good, Sergeant. Thanks for the extra attention to the port engine, runs smooth as silk now." His voice was steady, but McKenna noticed the slight tremor in his hands as Hayes pulled on his flight gloves. Fear and adrenaline, the constant companions of men who flew into combat. McKenna wanted to tell him to wait, that maybe there was a way to give him a better chance, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he was thinking about committing what amounted to sabotage in the eyes of the military justice system. That he was willing to risk everything on a modification that might not even work? Hayes deserved better than false hope. "Lieutenant," McKenna found himself saying, the words coming before he could stop them. "If you get jumped again, don't try to turn with them. I know what the tactical manuals say about evasive maneuvers, but in a P-38 against a Zero, your only chance is to use your speed. Dive away, build up velocity, and extend out of range. The Zero can't follow you in a high-speed dive. Its controls lock up and the wings will fold if they push it too hard." Hayes listened with the intensity of a man memorizing scripture, nodding slowly. "I know, Sergeant. But sometimes you don't have altitude to dive, or you're trying to protect bombers and can't run. Sometimes you have to turn and fight." The simple statement carried the weight of terrible truth, and McKenna felt it like a physical blow. As Hayes climbed into the cockpit, McKenna stepped back and watched the familiar routine of startup. The Allison engines coughed and sputtered, then caught with a roar that never failed to make his chest vibrate. Blue exhaust smoke drifted across the tarmac as the engines warmed up, and Hayes ran through his instrument checks with practiced efficiency. Around them, 5 other P-38s were starting up, their pilots preparing for a bomber escort mission that would take them deep into Japanese-held territory. The bombers, B-24 Liberators, heavy and sluggish, would be vulnerable, and the fighters would have to stay close, limiting their ability to maneuver. It was exactly the kind of mission where P-38 pilots got killed trying to defend their charges against more agile enemy fighters. McKenna raised his hand in salute as Hayes taxied toward the runway, the twin booms of the Lightning giving it an alien, almost insect-like appearance. He watched until the aircraft were airborne, climbing into the morning sky in formation, growing smaller until they disappeared into the haze over the ocean. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the maintenance hangar, his mind already churning through possibilities and consequences. In his toolbox, wrapped in oily cloth at the bottom, was a 3-foot length of piano wire that he had salvaged from a bombed-out missionary school in a nearby village. Piano wire was perfect for the job, high tensile strength, resistant to stretching, able to handle the forces involved in flight control. McKenna had been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for courage or desperation to push him past the point of no return. The maintenance hangar was a cavernous structure built from salvaged materials and covered with camouflage netting. Inside, it was 10 degrees hotter than outside, the air thick with the smell of solvents and hot metal. McKenna's workspace was in the corner, surrounded by tool carts and parts bins that he kept meticulously organized. He sat down on a stool and pulled out the piano wire, holding it up to the light that filtered through gaps in the walls. The wire gleamed, silver bright and strong. He could see exactly how it would work, bent into a Z shape, installed between the control cable and its anchor point. It would act as a tensioner, taking up the slack and making the controls crisp and immediate. It was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of field modification that mechanics had been making since the dawn of aviation. But it was also completely unauthorized, and if something went wrong, if the wire broke or caused the controls to bind, it could kill the pilot just as surely as a Zero's guns. McKenna sat there for a long time, the wire heavy in his hands despite its negligible weight. He thought about Hayes, about the dozens of other pilots he had known who never came home. He thought about his wife Mary back in Ohio, about the letters she sent filled with news of rationing and war bond drives and their daughter starting high school. He thought about the oath he had taken when he enlisted, to follow orders and regulations. And he thought about the simple, terrible equation that faced him: break the rules and possibly save lives, or follow procedure and watch good men die in machines that could have been better. The morning sun climbed higher, and in the distance, he could hear the faint drone of aircraft engines. Somewhere out there, over the blue expanse of the Pacific, pilots were fighting and dying in a war that seemed to stretch on without end. By the time McKenna stood up, his decision was made. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but there was also a strange sense of relief. He had always been a man who solved problems, who fixed things that were broken. Today he would fix one more thing, regardless of the cost. He carefully coiled the piano wire and placed it in his pocket, then pulled out a set of technical drawings for the P-38's control system. If he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. The afternoon stretched out endlessly, measured in heartbeats and anxious glances at the sky. McKenna went through the motions of his duties, supervising oil changes, checking magnetos, coordinating with the armament crew on gun synchronization issues. But his mind was elsewhere, rehearsing the modification over and over until he could see it in perfect detail. The P-38s would return, if they returned, in late afternoon, and there would be a window of perhaps 2 hours before darkness when he could work on Hayes's aircraft without drawing too much attention. The ground crews would be busy with battle damage repairs and routine maintenance on the other fighters, and with luck, he could complete the work before anyone noticed. The risk made his hands sweat and his stomach churn with acid, but the certainty of his decision never wavered. At 1,600 hours, the sound of approaching engines brought everyone on the airfield to attention. The P-38s came in low and fast, their landing gear dropping as they approached the runway in staggered formation. McKenna counted 5 aircraft and felt his chest tighten, one missing. He watched as they landed one by one, the screech of tires on the metal planking of the runway mixing with the roar of engines throttling back. Hayes's Lightning was third to land, and McKenna could see even from a distance that it had taken hits. There were ragged holes in the left boom and what looked like damage to the vertical stabilizer. The young pilot taxied to his hard stand with visible effort, the aircraft pulling slightly to one side. When Hayes climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat, and his face was pale beneath the mask lines that marked where his oxygen equipment had pressed against his skin. He pulled off his flight helmet with shaking hands and stood for a moment on the wing, just breathing. McKenna approached quickly, concern overriding protocol. "You okay, Lieutenant? Where's Mitchell?" Hayes looked at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the past few hours. "Mitchell's gone. We got bounced by 8 Zeros over the target. He tried to turn with them." The pilot's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man in shock. "I saw him spin in. Never pulled out." The news hit McKenna like a physical blow. Lieutenant Paul Mitchell had been 24 years old, a farm kid from Iowa with a ready smile and a talent for making the engines sing. He had wanted to go back to Iowa after the war and run his father's farm, maybe start a flight school on the side. Now he was gone, his P-38 and his body somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific or scattered across some nameless jungle island. McKenna felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the helpless fury at waste and death, and the bureaucratic inertia that kept better solutions from reaching the men who needed them. Mitchell had died because his aircraft couldn't turn with the enemy, because there was slack in his control cables, because the system valued procedure over innovation. Hayes climbed down from the wing, his legs almost giving out when he hit the ground. McKenna caught his arm and steadied him. "Easy, Lieutenant. Battle damage inspection, and then you need to report to Major Reed. I'll take care of your bird." Hayes nodded gratefully and stumbled off toward the operations tent, leaving McKenna alone with the damaged Lightning. The bullet holes were worse up close. 20mm cannon shells had torn through the aluminum skin of the boom, and it was a miracle nothing vital had been hit. McKenna could see where a round had passed within inches of the fuel line, close enough that the heat from the explosion had scorched the metal. Hayes had been incredibly lucky. As the ground crews swarmed over the other aircraft, assessing damage and beginning repairs, McKenna made a show of examining Hayes's P-38 thoroughly. He documented every hit, took measurements, filled out the required forms with methodical care. The extensive damage would require hours of work, which gave him the perfect excuse to keep the aircraft in the hangar overnight. He supervised as the tractor towed the Lightning into the maintenance bay, positioning it in the far corner where the lighting was poor and casual observers wouldn't pay much attention. The other mechanics were busy with more pressing concerns. 2 of the returned fighters had suffered hydraulic damage and needed immediate attention to be flight-ready for tomorrow's missions. As twilight fell over the airfield and the day's shift mechanics headed to the mess tent for dinner, McKenna remained behind, ostensibly to continue working on Hayes's aircraft. He wasn't alone. A few other dedicated crew chiefs stayed late, troubleshooting problems that couldn't wait until morning, but they were absorbed in their own work, separated by the vast space of the hangar and the noise of tools and equipment. McKenna waited until the light was just right, that peculiar dusky illumination when details became soft and shadows grew long. Then he retrieved his toolbox and the piano wire and climbed up onto the wing of the P-38. The access panel for the aileron control system was located in the wing root, secured with a dozen screws that McKenna removed with practiced efficiency. He used a shielded flashlight to illuminate the interior of the wing, revealing the complex network of cables, pulleys, and push rods that translated the pilot's commands into control surface movement. The cable he needed was right there, running from the cockpit through a series of fairleads and pulleys before connecting to the aileron actuator. McKenna reached in and pulled on the cable, feeling the slack that he knew was there. It was perhaps 3mm of play, nothing much, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, but enough to create that fatal delay in response time. Working by feel as much as sight, McKenna began the modification. He unwrapped the piano wire from its cloth covering and examined it carefully in the flashlight beam. The wire was approximately 2mm in diameter, strong enough to handle the forces involved but flexible enough to bend without breaking. Using a pair of pliers from his toolbox, he carefully bent the wire into a Z shape, creating what was essentially a spring tensioner. The geometry had to be exact. Too much tension and the controls would bind or the wire might break under stress. Too little and it would be useless. McKenna had calculated the measurements in his head dozens of times, but now, actually doing it, his hands trembled slightly with the weight of what he was attempting. The installation required disconnecting one end of the control cable from its anchor point, threading the Z-shaped wire tensioner into position, and then reconnecting everything with the tensioner taking up the slack. McKenna worked slowly, double-checking every connection, testing the movement of the cable to ensure it ran smoothly through the fairleads. The physical work was straightforward enough. He had been working on aircraft for over 20 years and his hands knew what to do, but the psychological weight was crushing. Every movement felt like a step further down a path from which there was no return. He was deliberately modifying a military aircraft without authorization, violating regulations that existed for reasons he understood even if he disagreed with them. If the modification failed, If the wire broke and jammed the controls or caused them to bind at a critical moment, Hayes would die. And McKenna would be responsible, would carry that weight for the rest of his life. But if it worked, if the elimination of control slack gave Hayes the split-second advantage he needed to survive a turning engagement, then maybe Mitchell's death wouldn't be entirely meaningless. Maybe other pilots could be saved. McKenna finished installing the tensioner on the left aileron control cable, then repeated the process on the right side. Balance was critical. If one aileron responded faster than the other, it could create unpredictable handling characteristics. He worked with painstaking care, measuring and adjusting until both sides were identical. The entire modification took nearly 2 hours, and by the time he was finished, his back ached from bending over the wing, and his hands were cramping from holding tools in awkward positions. When he was done, McKenna climbed into the cockpit and tested the controls himself. Sitting in Hayes' seat, he moved the stick through its full range of motion, feeling for any binding or unusual resistance. The controls moved smoothly, but there was a difference he could immediately sense. The response was crisper, more immediate. The sloppy feeling of slack was gone, replaced by a tight, direct connection between input and output. It felt right, felt like how a fighter's controls should respond. McKenna worked the stick rapidly from side to side, simulating the kind of aggressive maneuvering a pilot might make in combat. The ailerons responded instantly, without the slight delay that had characterized the P-38's handling before. It was a subtle difference, barely noticeable on the ground, but in the air, in combat, it could be everything. After testing the controls, McKenna spent another hour carefully inspecting his work from every angle. He checked the tension on the cables, examined the piano wire for any signs of stress or bending that might indicate a weak point, verified that all the original components were properly secured. The tensioner was visible if you knew where to look, but it was small and unobtrusive enough that a casual inspection probably wouldn't notice it. McKenna considered trying to hide it better, but decided against it. Any attempt at concealment might actually draw more attention if discovered. The modification looked professional, like something that might have been part of the original design if you didn't know better. As McKenna was replacing the wing access panel, he heard footsteps approaching across the hangar floor. His heart rate spiked, and he forced himself to continue working normally, not looking up until the footsteps stopped nearby. It was Corporal Eddie Vasquez, one of the younger mechanics, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. "Thought you might need this, Sarge. You've been at it for hours." Vasquez held out one of the cups, and McKenna took it gratefully, the hot liquid helping to steady his nerves. "Thanks, Eddie. Just trying to get Hayes' bird ready for tomorrow. He's got a lot of holes to patch." Vasquez nodded, looking over the damaged Lightning with a professional eye. "Mitchell didn't come back, I heard. That's rough. Good pilot." There was genuine sadness in the young corporal's voice. He had worked on Mitchell's aircraft, had known the pilot well enough to share jokes and cigarettes during the long hours between missions. "Yeah," McKenna said quietly, securing the last screw on the access panel. "It's rough." Vasquez lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, then seemed to think better of it. "Well, don't work too late, Sarge. Major Reed wants all available aircraft on the line by 0600 for another mission." He headed back to his own work area, leaving McKenna alone again with the consequences of what he had done. McKenna climbed down from the wing and stood back, looking at the P-38 in the dim light of the hangar. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it had before, just another war-weary fighter with battle damage waiting to be repaired. But inside, hidden in the wings, was a modification that could change everything or destroy everything. McKenna felt a sudden wave of doubt so powerful it made him dizzy. What had he done? He had taken it upon himself to modify a military aircraft based on his own judgment, his own calculations. If he was wrong, if he had miscalculated the stress factors, or if the piano wire had a hidden flaw, Hayes would die. And it would be McKenna's fault, as surely as if he had shot the pilot himself. But the doubt passed, replaced by the grim certainty that had driven him to this point. Mitchell was dead, and dozens of other pilots before him. The official channels had done nothing to address the problem, had shown no urgency about finding a solution to the P-38's handling deficiencies. Pilots were dying because bureaucracy moved slowly and because people who made decisions were safely distant from the consequences of those decisions. McKenna had the knowledge and the skill to make a difference, and if that meant violating regulations and risking his career, then so be it. He had made his choice, and now he would live with the results. The next morning came too quickly, arriving with the harsh jangle of the wake-up bell at 0500 hours. McKenna had barely slept, his mind churning through scenarios and consequences. He was at the hangar before dawn, ostensibly to complete the repairs on Hayes's aircraft, but really to have one more chance to inspect the modification in the light of day. Everything looked good. The piano wire tensioners were seated properly, the control cables moved smoothly, all connections were secure. McKenna had done everything right, had applied every bit of knowledge and experience he possessed. Now it was up to fate and physics. Hayes arrived for his pre-flight inspection at 0545, looking haggard but determined. The loss of Mitchell had hit him hard. McKenna could see it in the set of his jaw and the shadows under his eyes. But the young pilot had that peculiar quality that separated those who broke from those who endured. He would fly again, would face the enemy again, because that was the job and there was no one else to do it. McKenna watched as Hayes went through his walk-around, checking control surfaces, looking for leaks, verifying that the battle-damage repairs had been properly completed. The pilot's hands moved over the aircraft with a familiarity born of repetition, but McKenna noticed that Hayes paid particular attention to the controls, working the stick and watching the ailerons move. "Sergeant," Hayes called out, a note of surprise in his voice. "Did you do something to the control cables? They feel different, tighter somehow." McKenna's mouth went dry and he forced himself to walk over casually, as if this was just another routine question. "I adjusted the tension during the repairs, Lieutenant. The cables had stretched a bit and needed to be brought back within spec." It wasn't exactly a lie. He had adjusted the tension, just not through approved methods. Hayes nodded slowly, still working the stick and watching the control surfaces. "It feels good. More responsive. Thanks, Sergeant." The mission that morning was a fighter sweep over New Britain, designed to clear the skies before a bombing raid later in the day. 6 P-38s took off into the prograde dawn, Hayes flying as wingman to Major Reed. McKenna watched them disappear into the distance, his stomach knotted with anxiety that had nothing to do with the usual concern for his pilots. This was different. This time, he had changed the equation, had introduced a new variable into the deadly calculus of aerial combat. If his modification worked, Hayes might survive encounters that would have killed him before. If it failed, McKenna would be responsible for his death. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. McKenna threw himself into work, supervising routine maintenance on the other aircraft in the squadron, but his mind was constantly elsewhere. He imagined a dozen different scenarios. Hayes getting jumped by Zeros and finding that the controls had seized up at the critical moment. The piano wire breaking and jamming the ailerons in a turn. The increased control sensitivity causing the pilot to over-control and enter a spin. Each imagined disaster played out in vivid detail in his mind, and by mid-morning, McKenna felt physically sick with worry. At 1130 hours, the distinctive sound of Allison engines announced the return of the fighters. McKenna dropped what he was doing and ran toward the flight line, joining the other ground crews gathering to meet their aircraft. He counted the approaching planes with his heart in his throat. 6 had left, and 6 were returning. All 6. Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this proved nothing. The fighters might not have encountered the enemy at all. As the P-38s landed and taxied to their hardstands, McKenna forced himself to walk calmly to Hayes's aircraft, trying to read something from the pilot's body language. Hayes shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a long moment before moving, his hands resting on the control stick. When he finally climbed out, his face was flushed with excitement rather than fear, and there was an intensity in his eyes that McKenna had never seen before. The young pilot jumped down from the wing with more energy than he had shown in days and grabbed McKenna by the shoulder. "Sergeant! I got one! We ran into a four-ship of Zeros over Rabaul, and I got one." His voice was loud enough to draw attention from nearby crews, and several pilots were looking over with interest. Major Reed approached, his own expression showing satisfaction. "Hayes performed excellently today. We were bounced during egress, and instead of diving away, he engaged in a turning fight with a Zero and came out on top. I've never seen a P-38 maneuver like that." Reed's tone carried both pride and a hint of puzzlement. "I don't know if it was pilot skill or if something about that aircraft is different, but whatever it is, I want to see it again." He clapped Hayes on the back and headed toward the operations tent to file his report, leaving the young pilot with McKenna. As soon as Reed was out of earshot, Hayes leaned in close, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Sergeant, what did you do to this plane? It handled completely different up there. When that Zero tried to turn inside me, I reversed the turn and the aircraft responded instantly. I mean instantly, no lag at all. I was able to pull inside his turn radius and get guns on target. I've never been able to do that before. It was like flying a completely different aircraft." His eyes searched McKenna's face, looking for answers. McKenna felt a complex mixture of triumph and terror. It had worked. The modification had performed exactly as he had hoped, giving Hayes the responsiveness he needed to survive a turning engagement with the nimble Zero. But now the secret was out, or at least partially out. Hayes knew something had been changed, even if he didn't know exactly what or how. McKenna made a quick decision. If Hayes was going to fly this aircraft again, he deserved to know the truth, or at least part of it. "Lieutenant, I need you to keep this between us," McKenna said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "I made an unauthorized modification to your control system. Nothing major, just took up some slack in the cables using a tensioner. It's completely safe, I tested it thoroughly, but it's not approved through channels, and if Major Reed or anyone else finds out, I'll be court-martialed." He watched Hayes' face carefully, trying to gauge the pilot's reaction. Hayes stared at him for a long moment, processing this information. McKenna could see the conflict playing out behind the pilot's eyes. The military training that said unauthorized modifications were serious violations of regulations, warring with the visceral understanding that this modification had just saved his life. Finally, Hayes nodded slowly. "Mitchell would still be alive if his plane had responded like mine did today. You did the right thing, Sergeant. I won't say anything to anyone. But," he hesitated, then continued, "other pilots need this. How many more have to die in fair fights that we could win if our aircraft were properly set up?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. McKenna had been thinking about exactly this issue since before dawn, weighing the risks of expanding the modification against the cost of keeping it secret. "I can't modify the entire squadron without someone noticing, Lieutenant. And if the brass finds out, they'll order everything removed and probably ground all the birds for inspection. I'd be arrested, and the modification would be lost." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But if pilots started asking their crew chiefs to check their control cable tension, and if those crew chiefs happened to find the same problem I found in your aircraft?" Hayes understood immediately, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A grassroots solution. The crew chiefs figure it out on their own, each one independently deciding to fix the problem. No orders from above, no official program, just good mechanics taking care of their pilots." He looked back at his P-38 with something approaching affection. "Sergeant, you might have just changed this war. At least our little part of it." Over the next few days, Hayes carefully spread the word among the other pilots, describing his successful engagement with the Zero in terms that made it clear something about his aircraft's handling had been different. He never mentioned the modification directly, never suggested that anything unauthorized had been done, but he made sure every pilot in the squadron knew that his P-38 had responded with unusual crispness and immediacy. The message was subtle but clear: something could be done to improve the aircraft's handling, if you had a good crew chief who was willing to go the extra mile. The pilots, in turn, began having quiet conversations with their crew chiefs. These conversations followed a pattern. the pilot would mention Hayes's combat success and wonder aloud whether their own aircraft's controls felt a bit sluggish. The crew chief would agree to take a look, to check the cable tensions and see if anything could be improved. And then, working late at night or early in the morning when the hangar was relatively empty, the crew chiefs would seek out McKenna for advice. They never asked directly about unauthorized modifications, but they would mention that they had noticed some slack in the control cables and wondered if there might be a way to address it without going through the lengthy process of official requisitions and approvals. McKenna found himself becoming an unofficial instructor, showing other mechanics how to fabricate tensioners from piano wire or other high-strength materials. He stressed safety and proper installation technique, made sure each mechanic understood the forces involved and the importance of testing before allowing a pilot to fly. The modifications spread quietly through the squadron like a benign infection, each crew chief believing they were making an independent decision to help their pilot, none of them realizing they were part of a larger pattern. It was conspiracy by consensus, revolution by common sense. Within 2 weeks, half the P-38s in the squadron had been modified. The results were dramatic but not immediately obvious to anyone not paying close attention. Pilots began reporting more successful engagements with enemy fighters, particularly in the kind of turning fights that had previously been death sentences. The squadron's kill ratio improved noticeably, and casualties declined. But because the changes were subtle and because pilots are generally reluctant to discuss the details of what makes them successful, no one connected the improved performance to any specific cause. Major Reed noticed the squadron was doing better and attributed it to improving pilot skills and combat experience. Higher command noticed the improved statistics and assumed their training programs were finally paying dividends. The Japanese noticed too. After-action reports from captured documents and interrogations of downed pilots revealed that Japanese aviators were confused by the changing behavior of the American P-38s. The lightning had been predictable, fast in a straight line, deadly in a diving attack, but vulnerable in turning engagements. Now, suddenly, some of these aircraft were turning with unexpected agility, reversing direction quickly enough to get inside a Zero's turn radius. The Japanese pilots couldn't identify any visible modifications to the American fighters, couldn't understand what had changed. They began treating all P-38s with more caution, which in turn gave the American pilots even more advantage. One afternoon in early August, McKenna was working on an engine change when Captain David Mitchell, Paul Mitchell's older brother, who had arrived as a replacement pilot 3 weeks earlier, sought him out. David Mitchell was 30 years old, a veteran pilot who had flown in North Africa before volunteering for the Pacific Theater after learning of his brother's death. He was a more cautious, methodical pilot than his younger brother had been, with a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when others might have bailed out. "Sergeant McKenna," Mitchell said, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "I wanted to talk to you about my aircraft's control system. Several of the other pilots have mentioned that their planes seem more responsive lately, and I've noticed the same thing with mine since you serviced it last week. I'm wondering if you could explain what's being done." There was something in Mitchell's eyes that told McKenna this wasn't an accusation or a threat. It was a request for understanding from a man who made his living by understanding every aspect of his machine. McKenna considered his response carefully. Mitchell was sharp, observant, and connected enough to cause real problems if he decided to make an issue of the unauthorized modifications. But he was also Paul Mitchell's brother, and McKenna knew that the younger Mitchell's death had been exactly the kind of preventable tragedy that the modification was designed to address. Taking a calculated risk, McKenna gestured for Mitchell to follow him to a quieter corner of the hangar, away from the bustle of other mechanics and the ever-present noise of tools and engines. "Captain, what I'm about to tell you is strictly off the record," McKenna began, keeping his voice low. "Your aircraft's control cables had some slack in them, within factory tolerances, but enough to create a slight delay in control response. I installed tensioners to take up that slack. It's a simple modification, completely safe based on my analysis, but it's not authorized through official channels." He met Mitchell's gaze directly. "Your brother died because his P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero. This modification gives pilots a fighting chance in situations that would have been fatal before. Mitchell's jaw tightened at the mention of his brother, but his eyes remained steady. "Show me," he said simply. McKenna led him to Mitchell's aircraft and opened the wing access panel, pointing out the piano wire tensioner installed in the control cable system. Mitchell examined it carefully, his pilot's mind immediately grasping the mechanical principles involved. "Elegant," he said after a moment. "And you're right, this would make the controls much more responsive. But you could be court-martialed for this." "I know," McKenna replied. "But I'm tired of watching good pilots die in aircraft that could be better. The bureaucracy moves too slowly, and men are dying while we wait for approvals that might never come. So I decided to fix the problem myself, consequences be damned." There was defiance in his voice, but also a bone-deep weariness. "If you want to report this, I understand. But think about how many pilots might be alive right now because of these modifications." Mitchell was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the P-38's wing as if drawing strength or wisdom from the machine. Finally, he shook his head. "I'm not going to report anything, Sergeant. Hell, I'm grateful. But you should know that Captain Reynolds in the 475th Fighter Group has been asking questions. He flew a training sortie with one of our birds last week and noticed the different handling characteristics. Reynolds is sharp, and he's got connections in intelligence. If he starts digging, this whole thing could blow up." The news made McKenna's blood run cold. The 475th Fighter Group was stationed at the same airfield complex, and while they flew P-38s as well, their aircraft were standard factory configuration. If one of their pilots had noticed the difference and started investigating, it could lead to exactly the kind of official scrutiny that McKenna had been trying to avoid. "Thanks for the warning, Captain. I'll be careful." Mitchell nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Sergeant? My brother would have appreciated what you're doing." "I know I do." Then he was gone, leaving McKenna alone with his thoughts and his growing concern about exposure. Captain James Reynolds of the 475th Fighter Group was exactly the kind of officer that McKenna had been dreading: intelligent, curious, and possessed of enough authority to ask uncomfortable questions. Reynolds had been a test pilot before the war, had worked at Wright Field evaluating new aircraft designs, and had an engineer's mind that couldn't leave a mystery unsolved. When he noticed that the P-38 he had borrowed from McKenna's squadron handled differently from his own aircraft, his first instinct was to figure out why. Reynolds began his investigation subtly, asking casual questions of pilots and crew chiefs, comparing notes on aircraft performance and handling characteristics. He discovered that several pilots in McKenna's squadron reported unusually responsive controls, while others flying standard aircraft noticed no such improvement. This pattern suggested to Reynolds that the difference wasn't random variation or pilot imagination. Something specific was being done to some aircraft but not others. His engineering background told him that the most likely cause was a modification to the control system, and his test pilot experience gave him a good idea of where to look. On a Tuesday morning in mid-August, Reynolds appeared in McKenna's hangar unannounced, accompanied by his own crew chief, Master Sergeant Tom Kowalski. McKenna looked up from the magneto he was rebuilding to find the two men examining one of the squadron's P-38s with professional interest. His first instinct was to approach them and ask what they needed, but something in their methodical inspection told him they were looking for something specific. Reynolds was running his hands along the control cables, checking tensions, while Kowalski was making notes on a clipboard. McKenna's heart sank. They had figured it out, or were about to. "Gentlemen, can I help you with something?" McKenna said, walking over with what he hoped was casual confidence. Reynolds straightened up and fixed him with a penetrating stare. "Sergeant McKenna, isn't it? I'm Captain Reynolds, 475th Fighter Group. I've been noticing some interesting performance variations in P-38s from this squadron, and I wanted to take a closer look at the aircraft." His tone was neutral, but there was an undercurrent of determination that McKenna recognized instantly. This was not a man who would be easily deflected. "The aircraft are all standard configuration, sir," McKenna said, which was technically true if you didn't count the unauthorized modifications. "We follow all maintenance procedures according to the technical orders." Reynolds smiled slightly, as if acknowledging a game being played. "I'm sure you do, Sergeant. But I flew one of your birds last week on a training hop, and the control response was noticeably different from what I'm used to. Crisper, more immediate. The kind of difference that could make a real difference in combat." He paused, watching McKenna's face carefully. "I'm trying to understand what accounts for that difference." McKenna felt trapped between his loyalty to his pilots and his duty to follow regulations. If he admitted to the modifications, Reynolds could shut down the entire program and potentially bring charges against him. If he lied convincingly enough to deflect Reynolds's investigation, pilots in the 475th Fighter Group would continue flying with suboptimal control systems, and some of them would likely die as a result. The moral weight of that choice pressed down on him like a physical burden. He was saved from having to respond immediately by the arrival of Major Reed, who had spotted the unfamiliar officers examining his squadron's aircraft. "Captain Reynolds," Reed said, his voice carrying the territorial edge of a squadron commander finding outsiders poking around his operation. "What brings you to my hangar?" Reynolds straightened and offered a respectful nod. "Major Reed, I've been investigating some performance anomalies I noticed in one of your aircraft. I'm trying to determine if there are maintenance practices or modifications that might account for improved control response." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "My crew chiefs follow all proper procedures and regulations. If you're suggesting otherwise, I'd appreciate you being direct about it." The tension in the air was palpable, and McKenna saw his opportunity. "Major, if I might speak freely?" Reed nodded curtly. "Captain Reynolds is right that some of our aircraft have more responsive controls than standard. Several crew chiefs, including myself, have been adjusting control cable tensions more aggressively than usual, staying within tolerances but at the tight end of the specification range. It's not a modification, exactly, just careful attention to an area that's often overlooked. If Captain Reynolds' squadron would benefit from similar attention to detail, I'd be happy to share our procedures." It was a carefully crafted half-truth, suggesting that the improved performance came from better standard maintenance rather than unauthorized modifications. Reynolds studied McKenna for a long moment, and McKenna had the uncomfortable feeling that the captain saw right through the deception but was deciding whether to pursue it. Finally, Reynolds nodded slowly. "That would be very helpful, Sergeant. Perhaps you could show Sergeant Kowalski your procedures, and we can implement similar practices in the 475th. It was a compromise. Reynolds was backing off from direct confrontation, but making it clear he expected access to whatever was making the difference. Over the next week, McKenna found himself in a delicate position. He needed to show Kowalski and other 475th Fighter Group mechanics enough to satisfy Reynolds's curiosity, but without revealing the full extent of the unauthorized modifications. He demonstrated proper cable tensioning techniques, showed them how to adjust within specifications for maximum responsiveness, and generally acted as if he was simply a very thorough mechanic rather than someone who had fundamentally altered the aircraft's control systems. Kowalski was sharp enough to realize there was more to the story, but like Reynolds, he seemed willing to accept the official explanation as long as the improved techniques could be shared. The compromise had an unexpected benefit. The modified control systems began spreading beyond McKenna's original squadron. Mechanics from the 475th, learning McKenna's tensioning techniques, began to notice the same slack issues in their own aircraft. Some of them, either through their own ingenuity or through quiet conversations with mechanics who knew the full truth, figured out the piano wire tensioner solution. The modification continued to spread, now across multiple squadrons, still underground and unofficial but growing more widespread with each passing week. By September, McKenna estimated that perhaps 40 or 50 P-38s in the theater had been modified, though he had no way to know for certain. The improvements in combat performance were becoming harder to ignore. The 5th Air Force, which oversaw operations in the Southwest Pacific, was noticing that P-38 squadrons were achieving better kill ratios and suffering fewer losses than the previous year. Intelligence officers attributed this to various factors: better tactics, more experienced pilots, improving coordination with ground control, but no one connected it to unauthorized mechanical modifications because no one was looking for that. The stress of maintaining the secret was taking its toll on McKenna. He had always been a man who followed rules, who believed in order and proper procedure. The cognitive dissonance of simultaneously violating regulations and being praised for excellent maintenance work created a constant low-level anxiety that manifested in insomnia and a hair-trigger temper. He snapped at junior mechanics over minor issues, spent his rare off-duty hours alone rather than socializing with other NCOs, and wrote increasingly brief letters home to his wife that mentioned nothing of substance. Mary's responses showed her growing concern, asking if he was eating properly and suggesting he see a doctor if he was feeling unwell. One evening in late September, McKenna was sitting alone outside his tent, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing, when Hayes approached. The young pilot had been promoted to first lieutenant and was now a flight leader, responsible for 3 other pilots. His combat record was impressive: 7 confirmed kills and numerous probable, and he had developed a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in the squadron. Much of that success, both men knew, was due to the modification that gave his aircraft an edge over the enemy. "Sergeant, you look terrible," Hayes said bluntly, sitting down on an ammunition crate next to McKenna's chair. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" McKenna took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "I sleep fine, Lieutenant. Just tired from the work pace." Hayes shook his head. "Don't bullshit me, Sergeant. I know what you're carrying, and I know what it costs. You probably think about every modified aircraft that goes up, wondering if this is the day something goes wrong and a pilot dies because of what you did." The accuracy of Hayes's assessment hit McKenna like a punch. That was exactly what he thought about, obsessively, constantly. Every time modified aircraft took off, he imagined a dozen ways the modification could fail: the piano wire breaking, the cable binding, the controls seizing at a critical moment. He imagined pilots dying and their deaths being his fault, his responsibility, the price of his hubris and thinking he knew better than the engineers and regulations. "If something goes wrong," McKenna said quietly, "it's on me. Every one of those pilots is flying with a modification I created, that I pushed, that I'm responsible for. If it fails—" "It won't fail," Hayes interrupted. "Sergeant, you've done something extraordinary. You saw a problem that was killing pilots, and when the system wouldn't fix it, you fixed it yourself. You probably saved my life, and Mitchell's, and Thompson's, and God knows how many others. Yes, you took a risk. Yes, you violated regulations. But you did it for the right reasons and it worked. You need to stop torturing yourself with what-ifs and recognize what you've accomplished." McKenna wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the reassurance, and let go of the guilt and anxiety that had been eating at him for months. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had set something in motion that was beyond his control, that the secret modifications spreading through the fighter squadrons were a time bomb waiting to explode. "What happens when someone gets caught?" he asked. "What happens when a crew chief makes a mistake installing the tensioner, or when an aircraft goes down and investigators find the modification? The whole thing comes apart, and suddenly I'm not a hero, I'm the guy who compromised flight safety for dozens of aircraft." Hayes didn't have a good answer to that, and his silence was more honest than false reassurance would have been. They sat together in the tropical darkness, listening to the sounds of the jungle and the distant rumble of aircraft engines, 2 men bound together by a secret that could destroy one of them and had saved the life of the other. Finally, Hayes stood up and put a hand on McKenna's shoulder. "Whatever happens, Sergeant, you did the right thing. Don't forget that." Then he walked away, leaving McKenna alone with his cigarette and his fears. The near disaster came in October, during a routine maintenance inspection. A visiting team from 5th Air Force Headquarters was conducting spot checks on aircraft from various squadrons, part of a broader effort to ensure maintenance standards were being met across the theater. The inspection team included a technical officer from Lockheed, a civilian named Arthur Brennan who had helped design the P-38 and knew every rivet and wire of the aircraft intimately. When Brennan's inspection brought him to one of the modified P-38s in McKenna's squadron, the sergeant's worst nightmare began to unfold. Brennan was examining the control system of Lieutenant Thompson's aircraft, and McKenna watched with his heart in his throat as the Lockheed engineer traced the cables through the wing. Brennan's hands paused at the aileron control cable, his fingers detecting the slight increase in tension that the piano wire tensioner created. "Interesting," Brennan murmured, opening the access panel for a closer look. "This cable is tensioned tighter than specification. Someone's been doing unauthorized adjustments." He pulled out a flashlight and peered into the wing, and McKenna knew with sick certainty that Brennan was about to discover the tensioner. McKenna made a split-second decision. "Sir, if I might explain?" Brennan pulled his head out of the wing and looked at McKenna with raised eyebrows. "Please do, Sergeant. I'm very interested to hear why you've deviated from manufacturer specifications." His tone wasn't hostile, but it was definitely skeptical. McKenna took a deep breath and launched into the explanation he had been rehearsing in his head for months, carefully framing the modification as a response to combat conditions rather than a deliberate violation of regulations. "Sir, we've been experiencing control lag issues in combat situations, pilots reporting that the aircraft doesn't respond as quickly as they need it to when engaging enemy fighters. After analyzing the problem, I determined that the slight slack in the control cables, which is within tolerance for normal operations, becomes critical in high-stress combat maneuvering. So I've been taking up that slack using tensioners fabricated from high-tensile wire. It's improved combat performance significantly without compromising safety." McKenna kept his voice professional, matter-of-fact, as if this was simply good problem-solving rather than a court-martial offense. Brennan listened with growing interest, then climbed back up to examine the tensioner more closely. He spent several minutes inspecting the installation, testing the cable movement, checking the wire for stress points. McKenna stood by, barely breathing, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Brennan climbed down and looked at McKenna with an expression that was hard to read. "This is ingenious, Sergeant. The geometry is correct, the material choice is appropriate, and the installation is professional. But it's also completely unauthorized, and you know it." "Yes, sir," McKenna admitted. There was no point in denying the obvious. "I made a command decision based on combat conditions and pilot survival. I know I violated regulations, but I still believe, that the modification was necessary and that the risk of not implementing it was greater than the risk of implementing it." Brennan was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. He could report the modification, which would trigger an investigation and probably end McKenna's career. Or he could look the other way, which would mean accepting responsibility for allowing unauthorized modifications to continue. "How widespread is this?" Brennan finally asked. "How many aircraft have been modified?" McKenna considered lying but decided that if he was going to be honest, he might as well be completely honest. "I'm not certain, sir. I've personally modified about a dozen aircraft in this squadron. But the technique has spread to other mechanics, both in this squadron and others. My estimate would be 50 to 60 aircraft across the theater, but that's just a guess." Brennan's eyes widened slightly at the number. "Jesus. You've basically created an unauthorized field modification program across multiple squadrons." "Yes, sir," McKenna said simply. "And it's working. Our kill ratios have improved, our loss rates have declined, and pilots are surviving engagements that would have been fatal before. I can show you the combat reports if you'd like to verify the improvement." Brennan shook his head slowly, and McKenna couldn't tell if it was in admiration or disbelief. "Sergeant, you've put me in an impossible position. As a Lockheed engineer, I should shut this down immediately and recommend your court-martial. But as someone who designed this aircraft, I'm fascinated by your solution. The control lag issue you identified is real. We've known about it since the early test flights, but it was deemed acceptable within the overall performance envelope of the aircraft. With respect, sir," McKenna said carefully, "acceptable from a test pilot's perspective and acceptable from a combat pilot's perspective are two different things. In training flights over Arizona, the lag is a minor annoyance. In combat against Zeros over the Pacific, It's the difference between life and death. Brennan nodded slowly. You make a fair point. Give me 24 hours, Sergeant. I need to think about this, and I need to talk to some people. Don't modify any more aircraft until you hear from me. The next 24 hours were the longest of McKenna's life. He went through the motions of his duties, but his mind was elsewhere, imagining court-martial proceedings and military prison. He had put everything on the line, his career, his future, his family's security, for a modification that might now be declared illegal and dangerous. The waiting was torture, made worse by the fact that he couldn't tell anyone what was happening. He maintained a facade of normalcy, working on engines and supervising his crew, all while waiting for the axe to fall. Brennan returned the following evening, accompanied by Major Reed and a colonel from 5th Air Force headquarters that McKenna didn't recognize. The three officers found McKenna in the hangar and took him to Reed's office, a small corrugated metal structure that was marginally cooler than outside but barely large enough for 4 men. The colonel introduced himself as Harold Whitmore, Chief of Maintenance for the 5th Air Force, and his presence suggested that whatever was about to happen was going to be official and significant. Sergeant McKenna, Colonel Whitmore began, his voice measured and professional. Mr. Brennan has briefed me on the unauthorized modifications you've made to P-38 control systems. He's also shown me preliminary analysis suggesting that these modifications are both safe and effective. I want to be clear, you violated regulations, broke chain of command, and implemented changes to military aircraft without authorization. Under normal circumstances, you would be facing court-martial. McKenna stood at attention, his face expressionless, waiting for the other shoe to drop. However, Whitmore continued, these are not normal circumstances. We're fighting a war, and Mr. Brennan has convinced me that your modification addresses a real deficiency that has likely cost us pilots and aircraft. So here's what's going to happen. Lockheed is going to conduct a formal engineering evaluation of your tensioner system. If it passes their safety review, and Mr. Brennan seems confident it will, then we're going to implement it officially across all P-38s in the theater. You will work with Lockheed engineers to document the modification properly and train other mechanics in the correct installation procedure. McKenna felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him, but in a good way. This was so far from the outcome he had been expecting that he had trouble processing it. Sir, I thank you, sir. I'll cooperate fully with whatever Lockheed needs. Whitmore held up a hand. I'm not done, Sergeant. In exchange for not facing charges, you're going to write a detailed report on every aspect of this modification, how you developed it, why you thought it was necessary, what results you've observed. That report is going to become a case study at Air Force maintenance schools on the importance of following proper channels and procedures. Your technical innovation will be recognized, but so will the fact that you went outside the system. I understand, sir, McKenna said. It was a fair deal, recognition for the innovation balanced with acknowledgement that he had broken the rules. He could live with that. Major Reed, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Colonel, if I might add something? Sergeant McKenna made these modifications because the system was too slow to respond to combat conditions. If we're going to use this as a teaching case, we should also examine why it took an unauthorized field modification to address a known deficiency. There's a lesson here for headquarters staff as well as mechanics. Whitmore gave Reed a sharp look, but then nodded slowly. Point taken, Major. The system failed to address a legitimate problem, and a sergeant had to step outside channels to solve it. That's worth examining. He turned back to McKenna. Sergeant, you're dismissed. Report to Mr. Brennan tomorrow morning at 0800 to begin documenting the modification. And Sergeant? Don't ever do anything like this again. Next time, you might not get lucky. As McKenna left the office, he felt as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't going to be court-martialed. The modification was going to be officially approved. Pilots would continue to benefit from improved control response, but now with proper engineering oversight and safety testing. It was the best possible outcome from a situation that could have ended his career and possibly led to imprisonment. He walked back to his tent in a daze, barely noticing the humid evening air or the usual sounds of the airfield. The next morning, McKenna began working with Arthur Brennan and a team of Lockheed engineers who had been flown in specifically to evaluate the modification. They were thorough to the point of being obsessive, examining every aspect of the tensioner installation, conducting stress tests on the piano wire, calculating load factors under various flight conditions. McKenna walked them through his reasoning, explained how he had arrived at the specific geometry and material choices, demonstrated the installation process step by step. The engineers asked hundreds of questions, some of which McKenna could answer definitively and others where he had to admit he had relied on intuition and experience rather than formal calculations. After 3 days of intensive evaluation, Brennan delivered his verdict. The modification was sound. The piano wire tensioners were safe, effective, and could be formally incorporated into maintenance procedures for P-38s. Lockheed would develop an official technical order describing the modification, and would also begin work on incorporating a similar tensioning system into new aircraft coming off the production line. The P-38J model, scheduled to enter service in early 1944, would have factory-installed cable tensioners that accomplished the same goal as McKenna's field modification but with more refined engineering and manufacturing tolerances. The official recognition of the modification sent ripples through the maintenance community in the theater. Crew chiefs who had been secretly installing tensioners could now do so openly, with proper documentation and support from headquarters. Squadrons that hadn't yet adopted the modification quickly moved to implement it, and by November, virtually every P-38 in the 5th Air Force had been upgraded. The improvement in combat performance was dramatic enough that intelligence officers began to notice patterns in Japanese fighter tactics. Enemy pilots were becoming more cautious when engaging P-38s, showing increased respect for an aircraft that had previously been seen as vulnerable in turning fights. What McKenna and the American High Command didn't know was that the Japanese were conducting their own intensive analysis of the changing tactical situation. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakamura, a veteran Zero pilot with 32 confirmed kills and one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced fighter tacticians, had been tasked with understanding why American P-38s had suddenly become more dangerous. Nakamura had personally engaged modified P-38s on 3 occasions and had nearly been shot down twice, experiences that had shaken his confidence and convinced him that something fundamental had changed about the American fighters. In a report filed with the headquarters of the 11th Air Fleet, Nakamura described encounters where P-38s had matched or exceeded the turning performance of Zeros, something that should have been impossible based on the known performance characteristics of the American aircraft. The enemy fighters now respond to control inputs with unusual rapidity, Nakamura wrote in his careful, precise Japanese. Pilots who attempt to engage in turning combat using our previous tactics are finding themselves at a disadvantage. It is unclear whether this represents improved pilot training, modifications to the aircraft, or both, but the effect is significant enough to require tactical adjustments. The Japanese response was to become more selective about engaging P-38s, preferring to target the heavier, less maneuverable bombers and to avoid prolonged engagements with the American fighters. This defensive posture, driven by respect for the improved American capabilities, had the effect of making bomber escort missions less dangerous and contributing to the growing American air superiority in the Pacific. The irony was that a relatively simple mechanical modification, a few dollars worth of piano wire installed by mechanics working without official authorization, had created strategic effects that rippled through the entire theater of operations. By December 1943, the secret was no longer a secret. Military publications began featuring articles about the McKenna tensioner, describing it as an example of field innovation improving combat effectiveness. McKenna found himself summoned to headquarters to brief senior officers on the development and implementation of the modification. He was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring the anonymous competence of a good crew chief to the spotlight of recognition, but he fulfilled his obligations with the same methodical professionalism he brought to aircraft maintenance. Hayes, now a captain and a squadron commander, wrote a recommendation for McKenna to receive the Legion of Merit, a decoration typically reserved for officers who performed exceptional service. The recommendation wound its way through channels, accumulating endorsements from Major Reed, Colonel Whitmore, and eventually from the commander of the 5th Air Force himself. In February 1944, in a ceremony attended by pilots and ground crew from 3 squadrons, McKenna was awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptional technical innovation and dedication to the safety and effectiveness of American pilots. As the medal was pinned to his chest, McKenna looked out at the assembled pilots, young men like Hayes who were alive because of a simple modification installed by mechanics working late at night, and felt a complex mixture of pride and lingering doubt. The award citation noted that McKenna's modification had been incorporated into official maintenance procedures and had likely contributed to saving dozens of American lives. What it didn't mention, what couldn't be mentioned in an official document, was the months of anxiety and moral conflict, the sleepless nights wondering if he had made the right choice, the constant fear that his unauthorized work would result in disaster rather than success. Hayes understood, though. After the ceremony, as McKenna was accepting congratulations from other NCOs, Hayes pulled him aside. "You earned that medal 10 times over, Sergeant. Not just for the technical work, but for having the courage to do what needed to be done even when it could have cost you everything." The war ground on through 1944 and into 1945, and the P-38 Lightning continued to prove itself in combat across the Pacific. The McKenna Tensioner, as it came to be known officially, was incorporated into all new P-38J and P-38L models rolling off the production line at Lockheed's Burbank facility. Thousands of aircraft were modified, both in the field and at the factory, and the improved handling characteristics became standard rather than exceptional. Pilots who flew the modified aircraft took the responsive controls for granted, never knowing that just months earlier, the same maneuvers would have been impossible. McKenna remained in the Pacific Theater through the end of 1944, training new mechanics and supervising the installation of tensioners on incoming aircraft. His reputation had grown beyond his squadron. Mechanics throughout the 5th Air Force sought his advice on technical problems, and he became an unofficial consultant on field modifications and maintenance innovations. But the attention wore on him. He was fundamentally a private man who took satisfaction in work well done rather than recognition, and the constant questions and requests for his time left him exhausted and longing for the anonymity he had lost. In January 1945, McKenna received orders rotating him back to the United States. At 44 years old, with nearly 3 years in the combat zone, he had earned the transfer. His replacement was a young technical sergeant fresh from stateside training schools, eager and competent but lacking the depth of experience that came from maintaining aircraft in wartime conditions. McKenna spent 2 weeks training his replacement, showing him not just the technical procedures but the intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that separated good mechanics from great ones. On his last day at the airfield, Hayes, now a major and the squadron commander, presented him with a plaque signed by every pilot in the squadron, thanking him for keeping them alive. The flight home was long and uncomfortable, but McKenna barely noticed. He stared out the window of the transport aircraft, watching the Pacific Ocean pass beneath him, thinking about the pilots who hadn't made it home, the ones whose aircraft had failed them or whose luck had simply run out. Mitchell was gone, along with dozens of others McKenna had known. But Hayes was alive, and Thompson, and Captain Mitchell, and countless others whose names McKenna would never know but who had benefited from a simple modification made in defiance of regulations. The moral calculus was impossible to balance. Lives saved against rules broken, innovation against procedure. But McKenna had made his peace with it. He had done what he thought was right, and he would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. Back in Ohio, McKenna returned to civilian life with the same quiet competence he had brought to military service. He reopened his garage, specializing in aircraft engine repair and rebuilding. Veterans of the Pacific Theater sought him out, recognizing the name and wanting work done by the man who had saved so many of their fellow pilots. McKenna never advertised his wartime service, never displayed his medals, never spoke of the modification except in vague terms when directly asked. He was content to work with his hands, to solve mechanical problems, to live a quiet life with Mary and watch his daughter graduate from high school and then college. The war became something that had happened, a chapter closed, important but not defining. Hayes visited once, in the summer of 1946. He had left the military and was working as a commercial pilot, flying passengers across the country in DC-3s. Over dinner at McKenna's home, the two men talked about the war with the careful distance of those who had been through something profound together but had moved beyond it. Hayes mentioned that he still occasionally flew P-38s at air shows, that the modified aircraft felt like old friends, responsive and alive in ways that other planes weren't. McKenna listened and nodded and said little, preferring to let the past remain in the past. When Hayes left the next morning, the two men shook hands firmly, acknowledging a bond that needed no words, and then Hayes drove away and they never saw each other again. The years passed, and the P-38 Lightning faded from frontline service, replaced by jets and newer designs. The McKenna tensioner remained a footnote in aviation history, mentioned briefly in technical manuals and maintenance histories, but largely forgotten by those who hadn't been there. Lockheed's official company history mentioned it in passing, crediting field innovations with improving the P-38's combat performance but not dwelling on the details or the controversy of unauthorized modifications. The full story existed only in scattered after-action reports, in the memories of aging pilots and mechanics, in the oral histories collected decades later by military historians trying to understand how wars were really fought and won. McKenna never wrote a book, never gave interviews to historians, never sought recognition for what he had done. When researchers eventually tracked him down in the 1970s, he was in his 70s, still working part-time in his garage, still fixing engines with the same methodical precision he had brought to wartime maintenance. He answered their questions politely but briefly, uncomfortable with being treated as historically significant. Yes, he had modified the control cables. Yes, it had worked. No, he hadn't been concerned about the regulations. Pilots were dying, and he had a solution. It was as simple as that, and he saw no reason to complicate it with analysis or reflection. The historians who studied the McKenna tensioner in later years recognized it as a case study in innovation under pressure, an example of how field conditions can drive solutions that formal engineering processes miss. Military academies used it as a teaching tool, asking students to consider the ethical and practical dimensions of unauthorized modifications, the balance between following orders and exercising initiative. Some emphasized the rule-breaking as a cautionary tale, others highlighted the lives saved as justification for calculated risk-taking. McKenna, when asked his opinion on these debates, simply shrugged. "I did what I thought was right at the time," he said. "I'd do it again." Hayes survived the war with 15 confirmed kills and a Distinguished Flying Cross to add to his other decorations. He flew commercially for 30 years, raised 3 children, and lived to see his grandchildren graduate from college. In interviews late in life, he always mentioned McKenna when asked about his survival, crediting the sergeant's modification with giving him the edge he needed in several critical engagements. "A lot of us owe our lives to that stubborn mechanic," Hayes said in a 1989 interview. "He broke the rules because the rules were getting people killed. That takes courage that most people never have to find in themselves." Captain David Mitchell, Paul's older brother, also survived the war. He left the military immediately after VJ Day and never spoke publicly about his combat service, the memories too painful and the loss of his younger brother too raw. But in private letters to Hayes, preserved in archives, Mitchell acknowledged that his survival past August 1943 was likely due to McKenna's modification. "I think about Paul every day," Mitchell wrote in 1947. "I think about how a simple piece of piano wire might have saved him if it had been installed sooner. But I also know that Sergeant McKenna couldn't save everyone. He saved the ones he could, including me, and that has to be enough." Technical Sergeant James McKenna died in 1987 at the age of 86, in a hospital bed in Columbus, Ohio, surrounded by his wife of 60 years, his daughter, and 3 grandchildren. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service and his work as an aircraft mechanic but said nothing about the modification that had saved lives or the medal he had earned. Mary, who survived him by 3 years, kept his Legion of Merit in a drawer along with his other military decorations, never displaying them but never discarding them either. They were part of who he had been, important but not defining, a chapter in a life well lived. In 1995, the National Museum of the United States Air Force opened an exhibit on P-38 lightning operations in the Pacific. Among the artifacts was a section of control cable with an original McKenna tensioner still attached, recovered from a P-38 that had been preserved after the war. The placard next to it explained the modification's development and impact, noting that it had been created by a field mechanic working without official authorization and had subsequently been adopted as standard equipment. Visitors passed by the display case quickly, more interested in the restored aircraft and combat footage than in a piece of cable with a bent wire attached to it. But occasionally, veterans would stop and stare at the tensioner for long moments, lost in memories of aircraft and missions and friends who hadn't come home. The exhibit text included a quote from McKenna, taken from one of the rare interviews he had given. "I wasn't trying to be a hero or make history. I was just trying to keep my pilots alive. That's what mechanics do, we solve problems. This was just another problem that needed solving." The simplicity of the statement captured something essential about the man and his motivation, the straightforward competence that had characterized his approach to life and work. Hayes, who lived until 2003, donated his personal papers to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, including detailed notes on the combat engagements where the modified controls had made the difference between survival and death. His final interview, recorded just months before his death at age 82, returned repeatedly to the theme of McKenna's courage and integrity. "People think of courage as something that happens in combat, facing the enemy," Hayes said, his voice thin but clear. "But it takes a different kind of courage to stand alone, to say that the system is wrong and you're going to fix it even if it costs you everything. Sergeant McKenna had that courage, and a lot of us lived because of it." The full scope of McKenna's impact was impossible to calculate precisely. Estimates suggested that the tensioner modification contributed to the survival of between 50 and 100 pilots who would likely have been killed in engagements where control responsiveness was critical. Each of those pilots had families, futures, contributions to make to the post-war world. The ripple effects extended through generations: children born, businesses started, communities served, all existing because a mechanic in a tropical hangar had decided to bend a piece of piano wire and install it in defiance of regulations. Modern aviation historians studying the Pacific War identified the McKenna tensioner as one of several critical but under-recognized innovations that shifted the balance of air combat in favor of American forces. Unlike the development of new aircraft types or the implementation of radar systems, the tensioner was a bottom-up innovation, created by someone close to the operational reality and responsive to immediate needs rather than long-term planning. It represented a different model of innovation than the top-down, engineering-driven approach that dominated military development, and its success raised questions about how many other improvements might have been possible if field personnel had more authority to implement changes. The debate over whether McKenna's actions were justified continued in military ethics courses and among historians. Some argued that his violation of regulations, however well-intentioned, set a dangerous precedent that could have led to unsafe modifications if others had followed his example without his skill and judgment. Others countered that the real failure was a system so rigid and slow-moving that saving lives required breaking rules, and that McKenna's actions highlighted the need for faster, more responsive processes for evaluating and implementing field innovations. Both perspectives had merit, and the tension between them reflected broader questions about the balance between order and initiative, safety and innovation, rules and results. What was undeniable was that McKenna had acted from moral conviction rather than personal ambition. He had risked his career and freedom to solve a problem that was killing people he felt responsible for protecting. He had done the work carefully, had tested thoroughly, had accepted the consequences of his choices. When recognition came, he had accepted it with quiet dignity and then returned to the work that defined him. He had lived according to principles, solve problems, help others, do the work right, that served him well in war and peace. In the end, James McKenna was remembered not as a rebel or a hero, but as a skilled mechanic who had done his job exceptionally well under difficult circumstances. He had seen a problem, had developed a solution, and had implemented it despite significant risks and obstacles. The fact that his solutions saved lives and improved American combat effectiveness was the measure of his success. But for McKenna himself, the measure was simpler. He had done what needed to be done, had kept his pilots flying, had fulfilled the responsibility he felt to the young men who trusted their lives to the machines he maintained. In that personal accounting, regulations and recognition mattered less than the work itself and the lives preserved by doing it right. The piano wire modification that bore his name eventually became obsolete as aircraft design evolved and newer fighters replaced the P-38. But the principle it represented, that innovation often comes from those closest to problems, that formal systems can fail to respond to urgent needs, that sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting significant personal risk, remained relevant across decades and technologies. In military academies and technical schools, in discussions of ethics and innovation, in the ongoing tension between procedure and initiative, McKenna's story continued to resonate. Technical Sergeant James McKenna, 42 years old when he first bent that piece of piano wire into a Z shape, died 44 years later having lived a full and quiet life. He had saved lives, had been recognized for his contributions, and had returned to the simple satisfactions of work and family. He never claimed to be anything more than a competent mechanic who had solved a problem, but sometimes, in war and in life, that is exactly what is needed, someone who sees what needs to be done and does it, regardless of the cost. In the final measure, that defined not just his wartime service but his character, and it was legacy enough for any man.